I'm presenting this evening at the request of, I'm not sure who's requested is. It might be the utility director's request. Um, just to want to give I've been working with the KCC since its inception. I've been involved in the project for relicensing that since I guess, way back when, even before Chuck Brannick, the then electric superintendent, kind of gave an update to UAB back in 2014 and some of the work that we did prior to that. So thought it'd be helpful to just kind of update where we're at. This is not intended to be a complete look back in time, how we all of the ways that we got to today. There's plenty of information on the both on a number of websites. I'll mention a couple. So the city's website, we have information about the Kinney Corridor Planning Project and a hyperlink that takes you then to the municipal utilities website, which has a lot of information, historical timelines, filings and things with FERC and that through the relicensing process. And then there's the Kinney, I'll give these websites later in the presentation, but we have the Kinney, let's see if we're hot here. We have the Kinney Corridor Collaborative has a website, and there's some information being compiled there. And then we also have, when we went through the Kinney Corridor plan process, there's a website for that. So I'll provide those websites at the end of the presentation if you're looking for more information. I'm happy to answer questions this evening as I can. My primary focus is to talk about the partnership that the city, by extension, the Utility Advisory Board and the City Council has with the Kinney Corridor Collaborative. So the KCC, the Kinney Corridor Collaborative, is now a 501(c) registered not-for-profit organization. The purpose of the KCC was identified in the recitals for the MOU in 2019, and those purposes were primarily, I'm summarizing now, a partnership with the City of River Falls to provide public and private philanthropic funding for implementing projects in that corridor plan. It also was intended to bridge connections with all of the various community groups that were involved in the Kinney plan process, including those that were identified as official stakeholders in the FERC relicensing process, and also to help provide education and awareness of what's going on with this project in the community and support opportunities for further funding. So KCC is not just about raising private funds for the public project. In the MOU, I'm going to summarize a few of the things I think are important to keep in mind as we go forward. So the policy framework of the MOU was, at the time, the community felt it was important to kind of form an official public-private partnership to seek funds for the corridor plan. As some of you who were involved at the time know, or those that were living in the community at the time are aware, there was a number of conversations about how easy this would be, how hard it would be, where the money would come from, who was going to pay for it, all the different pros and cons of taking out the hydros, leaving the hydros in, continuing to operate, reinvest versus disinvest in the hydros. And so there was lots of voices coming, and the thought was that we wanted to have a kind of a place that we could go to have this partnership to seek funds for the projects that are identified in the corridor plan. Specifically, the MOU discusses a couple dates that are key. The Powell being removed by 2026, or the lower hydro dam, and the junction removed by 2040. There's also, I don't know if you'd call it a clause or a mention in there that I think is worth pointing out. There is some talk about, could this junction falls, the upper, be removed prior to 2040? And if so, if there's some reasons laid out which that might occur, then the policy framework calls for us to try as a community through the public-private partnership to identify how do we address any lost revenue that we would lose by closing it early before that 2040 date. And then it has a policy framework for this responsible financing plan, which is much discussed. Specifically, it defines responsible financing plan as no use of local general property taxes. So that I wanted to just pause at this moment because there has been some discussion, or I've heard some communication by members of the council or others that the Kinney Corridor Collaborative is to raise the entire amount of money for this project, and that there isn't to be use of public funds, or there was never an anticipation that all of these others would come forward with the money. And that frankly wasn't even the assumption in 2019 when the MOU was adopted. Several public meetings emphasized the impact of ratepayers versus property taxpayers. The council was specific in its use of local general property tax. At the time, it was discussed that we have a number of other funds of the city, including enterprise funds, that may be responsible ultimately for parts of this project. And that certainly we will try to minimize the impacts to the ratepayers, but the council kind of drew a line in the sand on general property taxes. Now, it's not to say that the impacts of general property taxes and rates of the electric utility don't fall often on the same folks, but there is a difference in the list of folks that pay it. There's a difference in the amount or distribution of who pays electric rates and who pays property taxes. And ultimately, the hydros are owned by the city, and the operation and maintenance, including licensing, permitting, and ultimately the removal of any of those capital investments are electric fund expenses. And I believe that was stated at several public meetings and forums throughout the process that we went through. Frankly, with the electric fund being the primary fund of the city, kind of responsible for ultimate removal based on what FERC comes up with and requires of us. So what's the point of the MOU? How do we summarize what the goals were? What is the things that we thought in 2019 that we would expect from each party? So first, the KCC is identified as the primary philanthropic partner. In other words, the city and its work with others that might be interested in supporting this project would either, depending on your definition, would funnel or refer or coordinate with the KCC for those funding sources. And not just philanthropic partner doesn't just mean bringing in the money, although that's a primary responsibility of a philanthropic partner, but it's also to build awareness for the project, both locally and at a greater awareness in order to take advantage of people that might be interested in supporting the project that are beyond our borders, but also to attract expertise. One of the things that was expected in order to pull off a project of this magnitude, recall, we're not just talking about removing the physical dams, but also doing a number of related projects along the corridor in the Kinney Corridor plan that involved recreation and habitat restoration and other things, is to try to attract expertise, or otherwise known as in-kind or volunteer donations to this project. What it did is it set out in the MOU is a framework to do letters of agreements or LOAs. There was some concern at the time by the council in particular that the MOU was too broad, there wasn't enough commitment by the parties, and what's the details? Tell me the specifics. And so the LOAs are intended to be the specific agreements between the city and the KCC in completing these projects. So it defines specific, first of all, what is the project and what isn't? What are we doing? And then each LOA is going to be separate, has to be separately approved by the city council. It did in the MOU talk about a funding horizon for all of these LOAs being completed by 2029. So that's another thing I wanted to point out to the group tonight, that already in 19, we didn't expect the money to be here in 21 or 22 or maybe not even 23. That the funding horizon that was outlined in the MOU was this 2029 to be further defined in LOAs, and we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So what do I think as a city administrator of the KCC, based on my read and involvement in the MOUs and all of these, what is the KCC funding commitments at this point? The KCC is committed to funding its own operation. That's spelled out in the MOU, that the goal is that they'll be an operating nonprofit that can generate enough funds to do their own postage and do their websites and the other things going forward. They did make a specific commitment in the MOU. It's not yet put in an LOA, but they made a specific commitment to $60,000 of an anticipated $120,000 FERC ILP plans, or at the time we were really talking about this decommissioning plan to be put together by heirs. We also talked about them raising funds for specific public improvements. And we had the implementation plan within the Kinney Corridor plan. So if you go in like page 70 of the Kinney Corridor plan, there's a section or chapter all about implementation. And that section lists a number of projects that were anticipated. It has dollar signs for is it $1 sign, something that's kind of smaller that can be accomplished, like signage, trail signage? Or is it a big thing like the Lake George stormwater rehabilitation or the downtown stormwater rehabilitation project that's got, I think, $4 signs after it? So it laid out in there kind of what are the plans that could be done and pointed us all to say, hey, when we're ready to do those projects, there'll need to be a specific letter of agreement so that the council knows what to expect from the KCC, what the KCC knows to expect from the council, kind of who's doing what in the project, who's bringing what money and what expertise to the project to get it done. And then it specifically identified kind of milestones and said those are going to be in the LOAs. But overall in the MOU, it already talked about a $5 million project that's primarily for the Powell removal, the lower removal, and then stream restorations projects. So we kind of put early in the mind of the KCC, there's a big $5 million goal to be raised through various sources to do these projects. What's the city committed through that MOU? The city committed to basically run through the FERC ILP process and cover the expenses required by FERC to do that. My slide says 500,000 to date, and that's accurate, but a more accurate number, which is more than 500,000, we're plus 700,000 to date on expenses, and that may include some of the Kinney Corridor planning and other things that people could argue about whether that's part of the process or not part of the process. But to date we've spent that, plus there's been Army Corps of Engineer in kind and planning services in addition to that. So that kind of matches up with that. If you take the 750 plus a couple 100,000 for the Army Corps of Engineers, that's that $1 million number that you probably heard from the utility director about expenses to date. And we made that commitment in the MOU. We've made that commitment through resolutions. We're committed to doing that as a city. It also said that the city would include these LOA projects and whatever the FERC requires us to do in our capital improvement plan. We've got that in the capital improvement plan right now for an additional estimated 1.4 million from 22 to 24 in the approved capital plan that the council has approved, in the plan that the council has approved. They've anticipated $1 million of that 1.4 being from the state of Wisconsin, and 400,000 or the remaining to be from electric revenue. Now, this does not include sanitary or storm sewer utility costs, which at this time we expect to be nominal or not substantial as part of the project. It's looking more and more like the decommissioning of the hydro will not involve significant efforts on the part of reinforcing sanitary sewer crossings or significant changes to outfalls with stormwater. So that's good news as far as our decommissioning plan. But I want to emphasize that that's not included in the current capital plan. That may be, as the UAB is responsible for providing advice on all utilities, there may be some projects and LOAs going forward that include sanitary or water or storm sewer. We also made it known in there that we expected that if these projects were contributed to the community and if the city council accepts a letter of agreement that includes a specific project, that we were anticipating in advance that those projects could be sold with the idea that the city would be on the hook for long-term maintenance of those projects. Obviously, the council doesn't have to accept a project that it doesn't think it can accept the maintenance, but we wanted to set the tone for the KCC if they're going out to raise funds, and that's a requirement that that's something the council would consider. And then the city also committed to spending money and effort on key funding priorities and efforts. So we've got among those, we've already started in haste the comprehensive plan and the bicycle and pedestrian plan, and then we have kind of in our long range planning looking at that Lake George area stormwater treatment concept plan. Some people call that the Riverwalk plan or the downtown stormwater interceptor plan. So that's kind of removing all the outfalls that are going into the Kinney and the downtown, getting them into a piping them to the south, and then building some bays or ways to kind of do filtering the water before it's released into the river. And that project has been in the history of the city independent of whether the dam stays in or the dam goes out. That project is kind of a project that can be done whether the upper is left or the upper is taken out. And we also have the stormwater shoreline ordinance and the downtown design master plans that the city anticipated it would be doing over the next this is a 25-year MOU, that we would be redoing those plans at our expense. So the current city and KCC goal is to focus on a single LOA. So we want to try to get ourselves off on one letter of agreement, and that would be primarily focusing or almost wholly focusing on the physical removal of the Powell Falls Dam. So taking out the infrastructure that we're required to remove by FERC, kind of protecting bridges, sanitary, other things that may be impacted by that, and getting that project done in a single project LOA. And that would include seeking funding from federal, state, and local sources, primarily through the DNR Municipal Dam Grant, which we'll talk a little bit about, Army Corps of Engineers, which I apologize for using all these acronyms, and we're not using the same ones in slides, so we'll get better at that. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is looking into feasibility of helping us do all these projects. So that's one thing. And then also getting this LOA would also include local stakeholder group support. In other words, it's not just the money, but we'd be asking KCC to round up the support. So when we go through this decommissioning plan, all the stakeholders are supporting us through those steps. So this is just a snapshot that's been presented to the council to kind of give you an idea of where we're at. We know that things have changed from when we passed the MOU in 2019. One particular event that people want that we always focus on is this flooding event and the choice to shut down the Powell Dam. We also have a pandemic that we've been going through virtually since we made these agreements with the parties. So everybody's been doing their best to work through that, deal with the flood, be flexible, and so we're still in that impact from flood risk. So we're still we brought the drawdown down. We're still in that case where we're watching that, monitoring it, and we'll have this spring to get through for sure. What's going to happen with spring flooding, and can we control the amount of sediment released into the downstream? So we are thinking of a number of LOAs. There's probably 5 of them on the table right now with KCC, including things like restoration or enhancement of the lower Kinney area. So that would be things above and beyond what FERC requires us to do. So those would be things that groups want to see, like prairie or savanna restoration, or specialized fauna or wildlife improvements, kind of the extras beyond what the minimum of the electric utility would need to be required. So that would have to be in a separate LOA, so the city knows exactly what the commitments it's making. Recreational amenities, specific launches or fishing areas or other things that are kayak portages, things that are recreational in nature that are beyond the scope of the FERC removal. Monitoring plan is one of the things that some of the stakeholder groups, DNR and others, are talking about doing a collaborative monitoring plan where UWRF and the city and others work together to do monitoring. And then there is forgive me, I can't think of the name that's mentioned in the Kinney Corridor plan, but where the former power plant is, there's talk of kind of restoring that area for some kind of public recreational launch, fishing area, etc. So that would be a separate, in our mind as city staff, that's a separate LOA that we'd have to see in detail what the commitments of the city. So in summary, I want to say the KCC is our primary non-governmental partner helping to obtain non-utility funding for removal. They are to try to gather voices. They are responsible for the commitments that they've made to us in writing. They are not responsible for commitments, verbal commitments, or anything else that KRLT, Friends of the Kinney, Patagonia, petitioners from Seattle or San Francisco or Chicago or Minneapolis, or even the local Trout Unlimited or the Minneapolis Trout Unlimited made to the city. And there's been a number of things that people can point to say, but you told us you'd give us this, that, or the other thing. KCC is not responsible for what other people told the city they were going to give us. They're responsible for the things that they've agreed in writing to do, and they're working diligently to do that. They are channeling with some of those groups with some success. One effort I can point to that's a success is a successful lobbying effort, which in my opinion would not have been successful without the city, our local elected representatives at the state level, the Trout Unlimited local chapter, KCC members, board members. They essentially increased the eligibility from 400,000 to $1 million. So that's plus 600,000 of eligible grant money that I expect the city will be successful in receiving. That's a specific example of what the KCC said. We need to do this, and they did that without an LOA, without getting some promise of anything, because they felt it was already within the MOU what we had agreed we were going to do together. They've also helped try to publicly advocate for the changes due to the flood with FERC. So when Kevin was kind of dealing with FERC and the utility director was dealing with FERC and figuring that out, the KCC board members have been supportive. They've been making phone calls to the DNR and FERC and letters to FERC and to our representatives to support that. They also are building a network of supporters for future phases. So they understand that the city's heard a lot of what some of us consider promises about money that's going to be coming. And so they are kind of following up a lot of those leads with people that they've heard whisper or say out loud, well, this is a great project. Of course, everybody's going to want it. And then they are, in fact, trying to follow up with those foundation boards, individual donors, habitat groups, and others to try to get our network built for supporting it going forward in the future phases. So with that, I hope that covered some of what you're interested and not too much of what you're not interested in. I'll mention the KinnicCC.org. So it's KINNICC.org. is the Kinney Corridor Collaborative's website. And the city has maintained the KinneyCorridor.org website. So that's KINNICORRIDOR.org. And so that's the website that kind of outlines the Kinney Corridor plan process and includes the Kinney Corridor plan. So with that, I'm going to, I think John will probably switch back to the WebEx, and we can go back to any of my slides if you have questions. But I'd be happy to stand for any questions that I might be able to answer for you.